Hi, I'm Jim Hightower, and I'm hoping that you will tune in to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour because it will turn you radioactive.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my co-host David Feldman. Hello, David.
Good morning.
Hannah's still up, but we have the man of the hour, Ralph Nader. Hello, Ralph.
Hello. One of the things we're going to discuss, listeners, are the lawless lawyers chosen to do tyrant Trump's illegal bidding.
The big story this week has been the protests in Los Angeles as the Trump administration uses ICE raids on immigrants as an excuse to call in the military to solidify his authoritarian hold on America. This is followed up by an unprecedented military parade with tanks rolling down the street in our nation's capital. Our first guest is Professor David Cole. He's a distinguished law professor at Georgetown and former national legal director at the American Civil Liberties Union. He's a widely published author on legal issues and will discuss with us the tool of impeachment that Bruce Fein, who will also be joining us for this interview, that Ralph has been advocating to push back on Trump's creep towards dictatorship. Next up, we welcome back Mike Ferner from Veterans for Peace. He's the former national director and current projects director at Veterans for Peace. And their latest project is Fast for Gaza, a 40-day fast that began on May 22nd. They are demanding a resumption of humanitarian aid under UN authority and that the U.S. stop arming Israel now. We'll catch up with Mike, who is halfway through his fast at this point. Then finally, we turn our attention to Texas and welcome journalist Joe Holley, who is a Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial writer and columnist at the Houston Chronicle. He was a colleague of Ronnie Dugger, the founding editor of the Texas Observer, which is a nonprofit news organization that addresses topics often ignored by daily newspapers in the state, issues that affect working people and concern class and racism. Mr. Duggar passed away on May 27th, that Ralph and Mr. Holley will discuss the work and legacy of this progressive champion. As always, somewhere in the middle, we'll check in with our relentless corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. But first, let's hear what the legal profession should be doing to stop or at least slow down what our first guest calls an unhinged presidency. David?
David Cole is the Honorable George J. Mitchell Professor in Law and Public Policy and former National Legal Director of the American Civil Liberties Union. He writes about and teaches constitutional law, freedom of speech, and constitutional criminal procedure. He is a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books and is the legal affairs correspondent for The Nation. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Professor David Cole.
Thanks for having me.
Welcome indeed, David. We're going to tap into your enormous knowledge and practical experience relating to the rule of law. We're dealing here with a level of lawlessness from the White House never before seen. Daily lawlessness in all kinds of directions. And the first area I want to explore with you is the extraordinary suppression of free speech, using the threat of government contract suspension and grant revocation against universities in an extortionate manner to get what he wants from these universities. And he's leading with this anti-Semitism charge against Harvard, Columbia. And you have said that you've looked into this, and he hasn't come up with a single case of anti-Semitism at Columbia or Harvard. How do you explain all this?
So I think what's important is to distinguish between anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic discrimination. You know, I don't doubt that there's been anti-Semitism at Harvard, at Columbia, at many places in this country, but anti-Semitism is not itself illegal. It's not itself discrimination. It's actually protected by the First Amendment. The Supreme Court most famously ruled that the Nazi Party had a right to march in Skokie, Illinois, home of many concentration camp survivors. Nazi Party is as anti-Semitic as they come, and the Supreme Court held that they have a First Amendment right to express their anti-Semitism. What you don't have a right to do is to discriminate against people because they are Jewish, to take action against someone because they are Jewish. So that includes harassment, targeted harassment. It can include creating a hostile learning environment through severe, pervasive anti-Semitic speech that denies equal access to Jewish students to campus. My point is that those are legal standards. They're very high, hard legal standards to meet. the Trump administration has used the term anti-Semitism, thrown it around. So have the Republicans on the House Committee on Education, without identifying a single actual instance of anti-Semitic discrimination that has been found to be adjudicated based on facts and circumstances, hearing from both sides and the like. And it's only when there's an actual instance of anti-Semitic discrimination that the schools in any way in violation of Title VI, and even then they're only in violation of Title VI, the federal law that governs entities that get federal money from the government, if they are deliberately indifferent to that discrimination. That is, if they know about it and they ignore it. And there's no show that Columbia or Harvard or any of these schools have ignored complaints of anti-Semitism. They have had complaints, they've adjudicated complaints. In some instances, they found them to be basis, to have some basis. In other instances, not. They've meted out punishment in some instances, and in other instances, not, just as they do with respect to sexual harassment claims that are made by college students. So that's the point. And Trump is obviously not concerned about anti-Semitism. He's concerned about targeting schools because they are places where people can criticize the president, where people can think independently, are taught to think independently, and often don't support what the president is doing. He's using it as an excuse to target a central institution of civil society.
And then there's the other side of what's going on campus, which truly is discrimination against Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, or anybody supporting the Palestinian cause against the Palestinian Holocaust, gendered by the genocidal Israeli regime headed by Netanyahu. I mean, on campus, these people have been harassed, they have been arrested, they have been subjected to dismissal, withholding of diplomas, firing of heads of Middle East departments, such as at Harvard. They have been punished in a whole variety of ways. And yet the attention has not been readily focused on this kind of discrimination. Describe the double standard here.
So again, I think if you look at what's happening to supporters of Israel in the conflict between Gaza and Israel, they have not been targeted by the Trump administration. They have been supported by the Trump administration because the Trump administration is on that side. By contrast, those who are critical of what Israel is doing in Gaza have been targeted, locked up, put into deportation proceedings for doing nothing more than expressing their opposition to what Israel is doing, an opposition that the Trump administration disagrees with. So where people are expressing views that he doesn't like, he is targeting them, whether they be students or whether they be universities. And he's using anti-Semitism as an excuse. He is not, in fact, seeking to do anything about anti-Semitism. And in fact, his administration has cut the Office of Civil Rights Compliance in the Department of Education by about a half, I believe. And so if you really, that's the entity that enforces these laws. So if you really cared about discrimination on campuses, you would not be cutting the Office of Civil Rights Enforcement in the Department of Education by half. In terms of Palestinian protesters being arrested, et cetera, it all depends on the situation. In some situations, they were arrested. In many situations, they were arrested because they were violating neutral time, place, and manner restrictions that don't allow you to have an encampment, that don't allow you to block access and the like. And, that's what protesters do all the time. They engage in civil disobedience. They should expect to get arrested. I don't think every arrest of a Palestinian protester is something we should be objecting to. In many instances, they are engaged in illegal conduct to make a point, and then they get arrested for it, just as people have done with respect to fighting racism in the South, with respect to environmental activism and the like. So I wouldn't paint too broad a brush on the targeting of Palestinians. I think some are being arrested for and punished for actions that they can be punished for, and they've just made the decision to do that, take that action because they think the issue is sufficiently important.
Well, the New York Times just had a full magazine article on Professor Finkelstein, an anthropologist at Muhlenberg College in Pennsylvania. And she lost her job basically because of just simple advocacy for the Palestinian cause. I'm talking about a lot of those kinds of situations, David, where they're not engaged in anticipatory nonviolent civil disobedience and getting arrested to make a point. At any rate, let's go to the larger issues of the lawlessness the chronic violation of constitutional provisions, statutes, regulations, international treaties by the Trump regime. He is the most impeachable president in American history. And he makes no bones about bragging about his illegalities. He wants to be referred to, if he had his preference, as the king. The only thing left that he really can't control is the impeachment authority in our Constitution. And so that's what I want to talk to you about, David, that we're at the point here where the Republic is crumbling very rapidly. It's hard to aggregate it all in a single mind. And the Democratic Party, as the opposing party, is not doing a very good job of focusing attention on Trump. You can test that by reading the papers every day. He's on the offensive all the time. It's almost never on the defensive. He's always on the offensive, the distraction, the high-profile attack, the languages he uses against people, which are invariably printed by major newspapers. So I want to get your take on the impeachment tool, because, as you know, Bruce Fein, who's going to enter the discussion, has drafted 22 impeachment articles for anybody in the House to introduce, and the Democratic Party has been reluctant.
I want to push back a bit. I don't think it's the only thing we have available to us to push back against President Trump. Civil society has been very active in pushing back. Harvard sued, public sector unions have sued, many, the ACLU has sued, I think over 60 times against the administration. And already over 165 courts have issued judgment against various President Trump initiatives. So I think you're way too quick to give up on the court. These measures have, by and large, not gotten up to the Supreme Court, except on emergency matters. And even there, the court has ruled quite strongly, for example, on the immigration cases of the Venezuelans being deported under the Alien Enemies Act, and Ms. Brego Garcia, the El Salvadoran man, who was deported by accident, and the Trump administration, at least for a long time, refused to admit that and refused to bring him back. He ultimately was forced to bring them back, and the court ultimately ordered that you can't deport anyone under the Alien Enemies Act while the legality of that is under consideration, and he hasn't. So don't give up on the court. Impeachment, yeah. Impeachment might be possible at some point. We tried that twice last time around. It didn't work last time around. And so it might at some point. I think it's completely unrealistic right now. You know, the Republican Party is behind him. He has sufficient control over the party that there's no way that he is going to be convicted in the Senate by a 2/3 vote. And so I just don't think that's realistic right now. It could change, you know, if there's some sort of smoking gun, if there's some, you know, if he starts using the military to go after peaceful protesters in ways that cause the American people to rise up, including on the Republican side, maybe. But I think for the moment, it's about civil society opposition. It's about people going out on June 14th, no King's Day, and protesting. It's about the courts doing what they are supposed to do, which is to uphold the law against him. And, you know, and I think if all of that happens, he may not get impeached just as he wasn't impeached last time around, but we can survive this whole thing. If we sit back, if there's nothing we can do, or put our eggs in the impeachment basket, which right now I think is completely unrealistic, you know, then I worry. But I wouldn't rule out these other forms of opposition at all.
We're talking with Professor David Cole of Georgetown University Law School. You make very important points, David, and I want to parse them a moment. He is losing a lot of these cases on a case-by-case basis. It doesn't seem to affect his momentum of illegal supremacy from the White House. He keeps opening up new fronts as he loses on old fronts. So I want to ask you this. To what extent do you think he is covered in terms of continuing illegalities by Trump versus USA, the notorious 6-3 Supreme Court decision last June, which in effect said, in his official capacity, a president cannot be prosecuted criminally without defining official capacity, as dissenting Justice Sotomayor pointed out so vividly. What about that decision, in effect, fueling unabated illegal activity?
So that decision, I think, was wrong. I think it was unjustified, and I think it's a dangerous decision, to be sure. Most of the things he has done thus far have been, you know, many of them have been in violation of federal statutes. Many of them have been, I think, unconstitutional. trying to take away birthright citizenship, for example, trying to deport people without due process. Those are unconstitutional. Targeting Harvard because of its academic decisions, that violates the First Amendment. But those are not criminal acts. They're unconstitutional, they're illegal, but they're not criminal. And in most instances, those actions have been declared illegal or unconstitutional by the lower courts. There are other actions he's taken which are not illegal. They're just venal, cruel, inhuman, indecent, but they're within the power of the president. And there, the only response is the political response. But again, the decision on Trump versus the United States is only about criminal liability for criminal acts, not for unconstitutional acts. And violating the Constitution is not a crime. Every president has violated the Constitution probably since George Washington. That's not a crime. What Nixon did was a crime, trying to benefit himself by breaking into the Democratic National Party's headquarters. That's a crime, to be sure. I think some of what President Trump did in terms of inciting the insurrection on January 6th was a crime. But what's going on right now, I don't think it's really, for the most part, it's not criminal activity. And I don't mean to, justify it. It's unconstitutional. It's illegal. But I don't think that decision is having a tremendous impact right now with respect to most of the things he's doing, because they're not even arguably criminal. They're illegal. They're unconstitutional, but that's different.
Well, I beg to differ. The Hatch Act and the Anti-Deficiency Act are criminal statutes, which he's violated in his first term, and he continues to violate in his second term. And who knows what's going on with the crypto economic self-enrichment activity that he's been involved in.
I'm not saying there's no criminal conduct going on, but I'm saying most of what we read about in the newspapers every day and what people are going out and protesting in the streets is not criminal conduct. Going in and picking up 4-year-olds in a public school or, rounding up protesters because you don't like what they say. Maybe that should be criminal, but it's not criminal. And much of the other stuff that you talk about, that may well be criminal. When we learn the whole scope of it, it may well be criminal. And then the decision will be a problem, a real barrier to holding him accountable. But I think the bigger issue is that he's acting unconstitutionally. He's acting in contravention of statutes. And there, the appropriate response is going to the courts and the courts doing their job and pushing back on people doing their job and getting out in the streets and making it clear that we want a president who obeys the law.
Well, let's move to Capitol Hill and bring Bruce Fein on this because, in the first term, as you know, David Cole, Trump violated over 120 subpoenas with impunity, including the June 6th committee. That came from Congressman Jamie Raskin's record. But Congress is a political animal. The Republicans are supporting Trump now, no holds barred. But if they think they're going to sink in 2026, they may start having second thoughts. So, Bruce, can you come in on this impeachment issue?
Well, one of the things I would like to add to what David had mentioned is that although Trump v. U.S. addressed criminal prosecution, it complemented an earlier decision, Nixon versus Fitzgerald, that said you can't get any civil damages remedy against the president, no matter how vicious and unconstitutional his actions were. So it means that even though you can get injunctive relief going forward against the president, what's the deterrent? He knows that as an individual, he's home free when you combine Fitzgerald with Trump v. U.S., which is a real danger. The second observation I'd like to make is that there are many unconstitutional acts that, because of standing, political question or otherwise, can only be addressed through impeachment. The court simply won't decide them. I mean, one example, among others, is the war power. The Supreme Court in 235 years has never said what constitutes a war, when the president needs to get congressional declaration, when he's acting in self-defense. The war power is only going to be enforced through impeachment. And we can see that in part by the War Powers Resolution. It's been around for like 50 years. No president ever pays attention to it, and Congress doesn't attempt to enforce it anyway. Now, the third thing I'd like to observe is impeachment is different than the court system because it's intended, as George Mason mentioned at the Constitutional Convention, to prevent or block attempts to subvert the Constitution. Now, anybody who's not been Rip Van Winkle over the last, 15 or 20 years knows every day of his political career of Mr. Trump has been attempts to subvert the Constitution. Some succeed, some don't. But not to understand that's his motivation, which is a motivation, as David would know, is regularly a feature of criminal prosecution, but here impeachment is designed to destroy the Constitution. He's even referred to terminating the Constitution if he thinks an election is invalid or corrupted in some particular way. He celebrated himself with a picture of being a king after he told New York City it couldn't do congestion pricing. He's flirted with the idea openly of being a dictator on day one, but perhaps after day one. We know that he said, among other things, according to his former chief of staff, well, Hitler did some good things for Germany. Perhaps, according to some, he bought Mein Kampf. He probably never read it. But I don't see how anyone can avoid the conclusion that Mr. Trump is bent, if he has his opportunity, to destroy the Constitution of the United States and to have one-man government. And that's true whether or not he's actually violated a criminal law. And that's where the impeachment power was intended to come into play. Benjamin Franklin at the convention said, impeachment is the substitute for tyrannicide. It's the civilized way you get rid of someone who is no longer a trustworthy steward of our liberties and the rule of law. And that defines, I think, Mr. Trump like a glove. And anyway, I'm not disagreeing with David at present. The political prospects are not high right now, but part of that is because they don't hold any hearings. We have a scheme now or a culture of constitutional illiteracy. People don't even know what the magnitude of the impeachment offenses of Mr. Trump. And some of those that we haven't mentioned, like the foreign emoluments clause, Qatar just being one example, but going around and having foreign countries subsidize Trump enterprises in exchange for what he thinks will be Trump beneficence in his foreign policy. All those kinds of things also can be addressed because of issues of standing, whatever, basically through the impeachment power. You got to start someplace. And formerly we had the Ervin Committee and then the House Impeachment Committee to educate the American people. Right now, that education process is not going on, largely because I believe Congress is somnolent. Now, both on the House and the Republican and Democratic side. As anybody knows, I've tried to get the Democrats, and you have too, Ralph, to do something, and they won't lift a finger.
Jamie Raskin said that an informal Democratic hearing in the House on impeachment would be a good idea. And there's nothing stopping the Democrats from having these shadow informal hearings. They've already had 5 of them, starting with Elizabeth Warren's hearing on the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau dissolution. So what we're trying to convey, David, is it leapfrogs to our own profession. We're not hearing enough from the bar associations, from the American bar, from the state bar. We're not hearing enough from the law schools, the deans. We'd like more open letters by law professors, as you have been doing singularly in your own work. And if our profession, which is supposed to be the first responder to the rule of law, is not alert enough to what's going on day by day, intensifying, entrenching, normalizing, then we're in even more serious trouble. Give us your views on Congress, impeachment, our legal profession, law schools.
No, look, I agree. I think it's incumbent on all of us to stand up and defend our democracy at a time when it is under attack like it has never been under attack before. And I think if we do that, we will survive. I think this will be an object lesson in how not to be a president. And there will be many reforms, in the same way as there were after Watergate and Nixon. But it depends on people speaking out. It depends on people not hoping that they won't get noticed. It depends on people being willing to put their names on record and saying what's going on right now is just unacceptable in a democracy, in a constitutional democracy. So, so thank you and thank Bruce, because you're 2 people who are doing that every day. This podcast is doing that, but it's something that has to be broadly engaged in throughout civil society organizations and individuals across the country. I have faith in the American people to do that. I'll be watching on June 14th to see, whether people are coming out to stand up for democracy, but I think they will.
Well, in these tormented times, we have to be affirmative the way you are. But as members of the legal profession, we got to focus more on the bar associations around the country and the Federal Bar Association here and the law schools which number over 200. We've got to rely on them to increase their energy level and their focus and their legal authority against what is clearly the greatest systemic threat emanating from the White House to what we like to refer to as the rule of law. Thank you very much. We've been talking with Professor David Cole, formerly with the American Civil Liberties Union for a few years, major litigator in civil liberties and civil rights, and now back at Georgetown Center for Law in Washington, D.C. Thank you for your continuing work, Professor Cole.
Thanks for having me.
We've been speaking with David Cole. We will link to his work at ralphnaderradiohour.com. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we're going to hear from Mike Ferner of Veterans for Peace, who is in the midst of a fast for Gaza. Now let's check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, June 13, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. Can artificial intelligence be used to blow the whistle on corporate corruption? Yes, it can. Anthropic's new Claude 4 Opus large language model was released last month. And Anthropic's Sam Bauman tweeted on the day of its release, if it thinks you are doing something egregiously immoral, like fake data in a pharmaceutical trial, it will use its command line tools to contact the press, contact regulators, try to lock you out of the relevant systems, or all of the above. Anthropic says Claude 4's whistleblowing can reach more concerning extremes in narrow contexts. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan, along with David Feldman and Ralph. Our next guest is in the middle of a fast organized by Veterans for Peace on behalf of the starving people of Gaza. David?
Mike Ferner served in the Navy during the Vietnam War, and he is former national director and current special projects coordinator for Veterans for Peace. He's the author of Inside the Red Zone, a Veteran for Peace reports from Iraq. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Mike Ferner.
Thanks very much.
Welcome back, Mike. We want to talk about the nationwide fast that Veterans for Peace is leading in communion with the victims of the genocide in Gaza. But before we do that, explain what you did during the Vietnam War era and how that affected you in succeeding years.
Thanks, Ralph, for having me back. I worked at a Navy hospital and took care of guys who came back from Vietnam. By the time we got them, they were a mess, but there was a good chance they were going to live. So what I saw, and I nursed hundreds of guys over the 2+ years I worked at that hospital. I worked in the psychiatric ward. I worked in the general surgery. I worked in the neurosurgery. And let me just tell you about the neurosurgery. There were guys in there who were never going to walk again. And I have not made a tour myself, so I can't say, but I've heard from reputable sources that the long-term care wards of VA hospitals are full of guys who haven't been out of bed for decades and are never going to get out of bed. And you have to turn them frequently to keep them from getting bed sores, and on and on and on. So these are guys that got hit with a bullet in the spine and they became paraplegics or quadriplegics. And, you know, at the age of 17, 18, 19 years, they're laying in bed and can't move anything but their head. So that was a neurosurgery ward, psychiatric ward, fill in the blank. There were guys who were injured in the illegal invasion of Cambodia, and I was taking care of them. And, they were in bed with, in traction and amputees and stuff. And we'd change the linen on the bed and be picking up shrapnel all the time that fell out of them. So those are some of the immediate effects. Now, Lord knows the suicide rate among veterans is higher considerably than among the general population, and at least twice as many Vietnam veterans have died from suicide as the 58,000 who were killed in the war, and that's just our side. We visited hell on earth on Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and we're supplying the weapons for Netanyahu to do the same thing in Palestine. And that's what got me started on a lifetime of activism and trying to, the best I can, work with groups that are seeking justice.
Well, you also were a vocal opponent with other veterans of the criminal invasion of Iraq and what went on in Afghanistan. You actually went to Iraq just before the Bush-Cheney invasion, and afterwards wrote a little book about your experience. And now you're part of a nationwide fast. You're in New York City. You are fasting to generate more media coverage about the U.S. co-belligerency in Palestine, demanding ceasefire, humanitarian aid, end of weapons to Israel. And for months and months, Veterans for Peace couldn't get any coverage. The New York Times, Washington Post, which covered all kinds of side articles on Ukraine, couldn't cover the Veterans for Peace institution here in the United States. With 100 chapters, many demonstrations, marches, nonviolent civil disobedience, one of them in front of the weapons manufacturer in Scranton, Pennsylvania. And you still couldn't get coverage. So you all decided on a fast, reduce your daily caloric intake to about 250 calories, which is the average intake reportedly in Gaza. And you still can't get coverage, even though you're past the halfway point of your 40-day fast.
I'm incredibly, if we can use the French word, pissed, but it's no surprise. As you well know, and so many other people know who do this sort of work, the corporate press in this country is either self-censoring or getting censored from the State Department or whatever, but they refuse to cover this kind of information. And therefore, our citizens are among some of the most poorly informed in the world. And when you're running a totalitarian shop like the current president and the previous ones have run, it's very handy to have a population that is not critically thinking and not aware of the information they need. So, yeah, it really burns me that we're in that situation. We've issued news releases to hundreds of news outlets, and we have got some response. Democracy Now!, which has a very good audience, mostly on the left, but they get to many people. They've covered us very well here 2 or 3 times. They've done stories. Al Jazeera, which an increasing number of people in this country get their news from if they want to find out what's going on in Palestine, and a couple of other international networks, print networks, have run stories on us. In addition to that, we've utilized as best we can the network of progressive podcasts and local radio shows that are run by people who care about these things. And we've done dozens of interviews on those sorts of places around the country. So we're doing what we can. We haven't given up on the bigs, as I call them. We're going to try everything possible to get through to them, asking other people that we know for contacts and so forth. So we're continuing to press them. And, I'll just give you one example. We went to AFP, Agence France Presse, yesterday, and they're in a fortress. It's an office building, 20-some stories tall. You can't get past the 2 guys working the front desk. And they say, who are you going to see? We tell them we just want to drop off a news release at AFP. And do you have an appointment? And no, we didn't. And we didn't have a contact that would come down to bring us up. So they wouldn't even take the news release at the desk.
As a member of Veterans for Peace, I've been making calls myself. And when you get through, they don't have any reason why they're not covering you. They just say, well, that's interesting. We'll put it down on our list or whatever. Well, the Washington Post had almost 2 pages the other day on a story about war dogs in Ukraine being adopted. And the New York Times had another similar story on dogs. There's no justification for their blacking you out here.
No, there's no justification. It's just the empire at work, and as well as anybody, Ralph.
Maybe, Mike, they're waiting for all of you to become weak in the 30th, 35th day, 39th day. Maybe that's what they're waiting for. But your hometown newspaper, the Toledo Blade, is preparing a nice feature. The reporter called me. I gave the reporter a 30-minute interview. So when you get back to Toledo, where you almost was elected mayor a few years ago, just missed by a little over 600 votes, people in Toledo will know what you've done. You've received the Callaway Award for Civic Courage at some personal risk, which is the criteria. Over the years you've been arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience. You've taken your share of political risk. So I'm curious, what do the passerbys in New York City, when they see you with your signs and fellow veterans, men and women who have seen the gory details of war in Iraq and Afghanistan and elsewhere. How are they reacting? You even had a demonstration on the floor of the Grand Central Station. Give us the flavor of the reaction of passerbys.
Well, it's been wonderful, Ralph. Of course, every once in a while you run into some Zionist that has to spout off, but reaction from the general public, when we're at the UN, there's a steady stream of cabs going by. We get lots of thumbs up and a couple of 20s from cab drivers. People on the street are very, very supportive. And even if they're not, rah-rah on our side, they are interested enough to take a flyer or engage in a conversation for a little bit. So once again, our government doesn't represent us and the mass media doesn't represent us. They don't want to know or hear what average people have to say about these things. And that's what's going on. So we just try to keep organizing and keep spreading the word, and things like the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are part of the mix to get this message out to people by hook or crook.
Well, we hope some of the progressive press will cover you, such as The Nation magazine, based in New York City, as well as other smaller progressives. Have any of the candidates for the mayoralty race primary for New York City mayor, which is on June 24th, have they come up to you at all?
Well, not only have they not come up to us, but one of the fasters who's not a veteran was informed kind of on the side that Zorhan is not about to step out on Palestine before the election. So there you go.
You're talking about Zoran Memdani.
Yeah. I hear he's very progressive on a number of things. He may have an excellent position on Palestine, but as with most politicians, they're risk averse.
He does have a good position on the Holocaust in Palestine. He's spoken out. I'm surprised that he hasn't come to see you, but there's still time.
Yeah.
Got another 2 weeks or more. And listeners to the program, help Mike and his colleagues out. Call the New York Times and New York Daily News and other media outlets, TV and radio. Ask them how can they justify not covering such a courageous demonstration of civic engagement against war, violence, and for peace and community. Let's go to Steve.
Tell us what it's like to fast in this manner. You're taking in 250 calories a day, and you're about halfway through. What has that been like for you physically? What, if somebody wanted to do this fast, what could they expect?
Well, you have to drink a lot more water than you ever thought. And, you're thirsty all the time. Your bouts of hunger where you really wished you could taste some of that wonderful food you're walking by in New York. And things slow down. I feel like I'm a 45 RPM. Oh, boy, this isn't going to mean anything to younger people, but I feel like a 45 RPM playing at 33 and a third. There's got to be a modern day equivalent to that, but things really slow down. Your brain doesn't work as well or as fast. You have sometimes it's hard to get a declarative sentence out. Your functioning goes down. And you can tell very easily. The thing is, Steve, is that we have clean water to drink. We have a place to go to bed at night where we don't have to worry about being bombed. And, you can imagine, in addition to being burned up, incinerated, and, blown to pieces, just even the people who aren't directly wounded by all this shelling to try to get through day to day. When it's an effort, and you get tired easily, you can't walk as far. And when you have to walk a long way to stand in line for water, and it's even hard to stand up for very long, what do? When it takes you forever to do what you would normally do just because your body and your brain is not getting the energy it needs. Your life is completely screwed up. 250 calories is officially, it's a starvation diet. And we're doing it for 40 days. But people in Gaza have been doing it for months and months and months, and they're dying like crazy. That's the whole concern that we're trying to raise. And I'll tell you, at the end of this fast, on the 40th day, we are not just going out silently. There are going to be some fireworks before we're done with this thing. So all I'm saying is stay tuned.
Well, you've already incurred some risk personally, Mike Ferner, and you've been helped by the Veterans Administration Hospital in New York. You've been pretty praiseworthy, you and your fellow veterans around the country, of VA hospitals, which have been scurrilously defamed by right-wing corporatists who don't like the idea of public health insurance and public health care. Give us your view.
Well, they're being defamed, Ralph, for the same reason that those right-wing corporatists defamed public education, so they can privatize it. And that's exactly what they're trying to do with the VA. And I can tell you, every single member of Veterans for Peace has got nothing but praise for the VA. And every VA person, doctor, nurse, staff person, and I've been to 4 or 5 different VAs now. I ask them, how long have you worked here? How do you like it? Every one of them says, this is a wonderful place to work. And it's called health care. And let me tell you, I got on the fast, I was not taking in enough potassium. And when you get down to a certain point, it's very dangerous. So I stopped in here just to get checked. Yesterday, I had to get admitted to the New York VA system because I was already in the Toledo one. So I had to get admitted to the system, had to see the triage person to say whether I should go to this service or that service. They said, you need some blood work. They sent me over to the blood work. I did that. I came out and I was completely done, less than an hour. And one of the guys that's fasting here, Ken Ash from North Carolina, I saw a funny looking spot on his back. And I said, why don't you go to the VA and have that checked out? Well, he did. That was on a Sunday night. And Wednesday, today, he got to see the dermatologist. Now, how long does it take for most people in the regular healthcare system to see a specialist like that? And now, they're working on me to get the potassium back up. They did some blood work, and the doctor comes in who is a trainee at one of the many medical schools in New York, which the VA does millions of these sessions of trainees with local medical centers. And she came in and said, well, this blood pressure medicine you're on, it really is, we're going to revamp that because it's doing this, that. She explained the entire thing. And the VA doctors in Toledo were trying to sort it out as well. But she thinks she has a better approach. And, she just mentioned like 3 or 4 things. It's not, do you have insurance? Who's your insurer? It's, here's my VA card. And where does it hurt? What can we do for you? And then once they take care of that, they say, is there anything else we can do? And I mean, my God, it's the way it ought to work. And it does work in this system. It's wonderful. And that's why the right-wingers and the people who make billions of dollars ripping people off with our healthcare, disease care system, why they want to get rid of this, because it's, in their eyes, a bad example of what can happen if the public actually runs an institution they need.
Well, Trump is determined to run the VA into the ground. He's already laying off thousands of VA workers, and there are demonstrations by veterans in early June all over the country. Hands off the VA.
Right.
So they're getting some pushback from the support by veterans. And Donald Trump, who is a chronic draft dodger, in addition to being a convicted felon, may meet his match if he tries to run the VA, the Veterans Administration hospital networks around the country, into the ground. Well, we have to conclude. We've been talking with Mike Ferner, one of Veterans for Peace longtime leaders, policy director, formerly executive director of Veterans for Peace. Before we close, Mike, please take care of yourself, take care of your health. We'll still try to get media coverage, and anything listeners can do to achieve that goal would be most welcome. And is there any last-minute comment you want to make before we conclude?
Yeah, Ralph, thank you. And, what you're doing is part of what I want to say, and that is nobody is going to stop this genocide but us until people of this country in particular and the rest of the world wake up and mobilize and just make it impossible to continue business as usual. This is what we're going to get. So all of our efforts as we go along here with your program and others are the key to this. This is not going to happen from the top down.
On that point, thank you very much, Mike Ferner of Veterans for Peace. Thank you.
Thank you, Ralph.
We've been speaking to Mike Ferner. We will link to Fast for Gaza at RalphNaderRadioHour.com.
Stand up, stand up.
The late Ronnie Dugger was a pioneering progressive journalist deep in the heart of Texas. Here to pay tribute to his legacy is one of his colleagues. David?
Joe Holley was the editor of the Texas Observer in the early 1980s, a former staff writer at the Washington Post, and a Pulitzer Prize-winning editorial writer and columnist at the Houston Chronicle. He is the author of 8 books, mostly about Texas. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Joe Holley.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Joe. Well, we want to remember the life of Ronnie Dugger, a superb progressive journalist in Texas, Texas-born. He died a few weeks ago in Texas. He graduated from the University of Texas in Austin. And in late 1954, something happened that changed his life. What was it?
Ralph, Ronnie was a 24-year-old recent graduate at the University of Texas, and he had in mind sort of drifting down to Mexico on a shrimp boat and coming back with migrant workers, and maybe on the way he would write a novel. But a couple of days before he headed south to Veracruz or wherever he was going to go, he got a call from a group of Texas liberals, progressives, whatever the word should be, informing him that they were contemplating starting a publication that would be sort of the voice of Texas liberals. And they wondered if young Ronnie Dugger, who had recently been the editor of the Daily Texan, the University of Texas student publication, whether he might be interested in being editor. And they told him that this new publication would be the sort of the house organ of Texas liberals. And Ronnie, young and presumptuous, said he was interested, but he didn't want to be editor of any kind of house organ. He wanted total editorial independence. And they thought about it for a while, said, okay, and the Texas Observer was born in 1954.
Well, it was a lonely newspaper, as you know, in Texas politics. Although in the early years, there was some Democratic Party presence in Texas. We had later Congressman Bob Eckhart from Houston, a great progressive. We had Senator Ralph Yarborough. And then it all became, a red state, very, very Republican, the worst kind. And in your obituary, you quote Duggar. Duggar said in a journalism essay, he called it Journalism for Justice. He said, quote, when we began, there was a silence in Texas about racism, poverty, and corporate power. As Ralph Yarborough never let us forget, we ranked dead last among the major states and next to last in the South in education, health care, and programs for the poor. We were Texas, a backwater, brackish and bigoted and brutal, slow and rich and poor, end quote. Well, he had an interesting combination. I mean, he was a skeptic. He knew the dark side of Texas, but he always had an upbeat personality. I had numerous conversations with Ronnie, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and he was ferociously independent. One of his big backers was an insurance company, a multimillionaire, Bernard Rappaport, out of Waco, Texas. He was a famous progressive and liberal, gave to a lot of liberal causes. But in one meeting that Ronnie had with him, Ronnie said, you're funding the Texas Observer, and I'm going to go after the insurance companies. You know that, don't you? And Rappaport said, of course, that's why I'm funding you. So that's the kind of liberal philanthropist that aggregated around Ronnie Dugger. And tell our listeners some of the articles that he wrote and some of the impact he had on journalism and policy in Texas.
It's useful to keep in mind, Ralph, that there has always been a hearty band of progressives, liberals, populists, whatever the description should be. This state also has always been a one-party state. First of all, for 100 years, Democrats, and then beginning in, say, the 90s, Republicans. We pride ourselves on being a band of independents down here, but we sort of migrate lemming-like to one party or another. And when Democrats were in control of the state, there were 2 factions. There were the conservative Democrats, who are now the Republicans, and there was this band of progressive liberals in the state. And Ronnie, as that young editor that we talked about a few minutes ago, realized that in this state, the voice of those progressives just wasn't heard in the big daily papers. The big daily papers, Dallas, Houston, Fort Worth, San Antonio, were lazy. And so Ronnie, on his own, between sessions of the legislature down here meets every other year. So when they would go home, when they would leave Austin, Ronnie would get in his beat-it-up old 1948 Chevy, not a Pinto, Ralph, but a Chevy. And he called it the Green Hornet. And he would drive these back roads of Texas, and the Green Hornet would inevitably break down. And so Ronnie would hang around those little towns until he could get it fixed. And he would talk to people, and he would find out things going on about racial discrimination, about farm workers being mistreated, all kinds of stories that the big papers weren't reporting. And this one guy, young Ronnie Dugger, would write these stories and expose things about Texas that a lot of Texans just flat did not know.
Well, there are all kinds of great stories about Ronnie, but one thing he did is he brought on young journalists who became famous in their own right.
That's right.
Like Willie Morris and Molly Ivins. Tell us about those two.
As Willie Morris said, Ronnie was one of the great reporters of our time. And all of us who worked with Ronnie learned from it. Willie Morris was editor of the Daily Texan right after Ronnie had been editor, and had his own battles with the University of Texas Board of Regents, who censored Willie when he tried to write about legislators and congressmen in the pocket of big oil down here. And so Willie came on to replace Ronnie because Ronnie, this one-man reporting show got tired. And so it was Willie's turn to do that. And Willie said the same thing that Molly said, that Kay Northcott said, that I say. Ronnie taught us how to be thorough, how to be fair, how to make that one more call. When I came on in 1980, he stayed around for a little while just to make sure I knew sort of what I was doing. And then he went off and finished his long-delayed biography of LBJ. And so for the few weeks we were working together, he would be just on the other side of a bookshelf in our office. And I would hear him making those calls and hear how thorough he was and how courteous he was. And he would warn people when he was writing about things that they didn't necessarily want to be known, that he was going to print their story. He would be fair, but it would be something that maybe the rest of Texas didn't know, but needed to know.
Well, how about Molly Ivins?
Molly was a Texan, a Houstonian. She was working in Minneapolis when there was an opening at the Observer, and Ronnie and the editor at the time, Kay Northcott, heard about her. She applied. She sent a letter. She was one of the few young women who applied, Kay Northcott told me. And so the Observer spent money they didn't have to fly her down to Austin for an interview. And they realized she was somebody a bit different than the young men, particularly who had applied, partly because when they took her to lunch, she brought her own six-pack for herself. She wasn't intending to share it with Ronnie and Kay. And I think Ronnie was a bit apprehensive about her humor, and yet he was willing to take a chance. And of course, Molly became probably the best known of the long line of Observer editors and reporters.
Listening to you, Joe, our listeners should know that something like this can happen in every state. There's no reason why people cannot have their own weekly progressive newspaper in places like New York, Massachusetts, Georgia, Florida. A remarkably small amount of money, actually. He never had a circulation more than 6,000 or so. He aspired to have 10,000. But he had an outsized impact. Of course, Texas had a tradition. Back in 1900, there was a newsletter that went all over the world. It was called Brand's Iconoclast. Put out by one guy. There's a book written on it. And it was in those days, postage rates were pretty cheap. And you could get a newsletter like that, lickety-split, anywhere in the country. He had readers around the world.
He did.
Brand the Iconoclast. The paragraph in your obituary, that's what sort of sums up Ronnie Duggar's purpose as a journalist. And he said, in Austin, he recalled listening to lawmakers in the legislature, quote, as demagogues berating every attempt to favor the poor in legislation as socialist or communist, and realizing that business bribery was the legislature's way of life. I understand, Duggar continued, that my state had been corrupted by the major corporations and that the daily newspapers silent or abusive about almost everything that mattered. were a part of that corruption, unquote.
He got early on a sense of right and wrong. And, I think as part of the obituary, I remember a quote about how he realized that just pointing out wrong doesn't necessarily persuade others to right, R-I-G-H-T, the wrong, that it takes more than that.
Any last words for our listeners?
Well, I think maybe his time will come again. It won't be Ronnie, of course, but maybe that idea of the crusading journalist working for a small publication, we call it a publication, but maybe it's Substack, all these other outlets that didn't exist when Ronnie was at the height of his powers. Maybe there's a place for the Ronnie Duggars of the journalism world again.
Thank you for sharing something about this remarkable man's life. We've been talking with Joe Holley about the life of Ronnie Dugger in Texas, and we need Ronnie Duggars in every state of the country. Thank you.
You're welcome, Ralph. Thanks for having me.
That's our show. I want to thank our guests again, David Cole, Mike Ferner, and Joe Holley. For those of you listening on the radio, we're going to cut out now. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call The Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with, in case you haven't heard, a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's at nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, it's at corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. It's at tortmuseum.org. You can explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of the Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, it's at capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer, Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, everybody. I'll bet you Ronnie Dugger would have loved the Capitol Hill Citizen. It was this type of journalism, unofficial journalism on Capitol Hill, 40 pages, packed, to empower you to put more pressure on Congress to represent the people, not the corporations.
Stand up, step up, step up. You ought to step up. Rise up, rise up. I know you ought to rise up and stand up, stand up.